For centuries, an extraordinary war has raged across the world's oceans, above and below the waves.
You could kill hundreds of people with one broadside. These were extremely powerful war machines.
Shipbuilders designed bigger and faster vessels to outwit and crush their opponents.
That nation that has most powerful battleship fleet can destroy the enemy's battleship fleet and therefore control the seas. And if you control the seas, you control the world.
They carried terrifying weapons.
This was going to be the first time that somebody had fired a torpedo in anger since World War II. They needed to get it right.
But ships have also liberated and rescued thousands.
You can think of Gerda 3 as basically a lifeboat for persons hunted by the Nazis.
And inspired men and women to acts of incredible bravery.
I will take you there now, to your cannons, to your death. We will sink before surrender.
These vessels and their crews have shaped world history.
As the commanding officer of a missile-carrying submarine, I was directly responsible for helping to prevent World War III.
This time, battles at sea, not with warships, but with something far smaller.
I don't know anything in the history of midget submarines that could function as well as this did.
From outlandish technology to a simple lifeboat, these are the unlikely stories of our smallest ships of war.
This is not a suicide weapon. We want them to get home so they can do their job again.
For centuries, the smallest vessels have served the bravest of pioneers and delivered triumphs against the odds.
The German was a damn good soldier. It was man against boys, really.
In 1935, an old wooden boat was recovered from a lake in New York State. Her cannons were still intact. It was soon confirmed that this was the oldest American combat ship ever found. The gunboat, Philadelphia. The Philadelphia fought and sank in the American War of Independence. Over 200 years of US naval history can be traced right back to this small gunboat. By 1776, the Revolutionary War was into its second year. The brand new Philadelphia's task was to defend the Champlain Valley, the American colony's northern frontier. It was feared the British would try to crush the rebellion by launching an attack from Canada. For both sides in the war, rivers and waterways were key transport arteries.
There were very few frontier roads in those days, so using the water was the main way, not only to move troops, but to move in particular their supplies. So whoever had command of the lake in that campaign was going to be dominant, and both sides knew this.
Defending Lake Champlain for the Americans was General Benedict Arnold. He had little time and few resources.
The Americans had to build their ships from the standing timber of the forests, and that was the creation of this little gunboat navy that Benedict Arnold was mostly responsible for putting together.
The Philadelphia was one of those hastily built boats. She boasted just one sail, but was armed with 3 cannons, one facing forward, and one each to port and starboard. Bundles of wood were strapped to the sides of the oak hull to give the crew basic protection from enemy fire. Against the British, they would need all the help they could get.
The men who made up the crews for these were not sailors. These were volunteers, these were soldiers, militiamen, maybe a few of them had sailed a boat before, most had not. This was very much an amateur hour for the American fleet.
Even Benedict Arnold admitted his men were a wretched, motley crew. On the morning of October the 11th, 1776, 30 British vessels swept down from the north. Waiting for them by Valker Island was Arnold's fleet of only 15 vessels.
The British had every advantage. They had several heavy guns, and they absolutely dominated the confrontation.
The pride of the American fleet, the Royal Savage, was run aground and then set alight by the British. Arnold's small fleet fought bravely all day, but they were outgunned. As dusk approached, the Philadelphia was hit by a 24-pound shot. She was doomed. She sank so quickly that when she was brought to the surface 160 years later, one cannon still had iron shot in its muzzle, ready to be fired. Soundly defeated, the 5 remaining American boats fled.
The British chased them up the lake, sinking several, and those that were not sunk were run aground and set afire.
Benedict Arnold and his fellow survivors eventually escaped across land to rebel lines further south. But the Americans had at least bought themselves time, because the British soon returned north to see out the winter in Canada. The gunboat Philadelphia's career had lasted all of 2 months, but her legacy lasted much longer. When the United States finally won its independence, they kept faith with small gunboats. They quickly became better crewed and better armed. In 1862, Philadelphia's natural successor became a legendary vessel of the American Civil War, the USS Monitor.
She is flat-bottomed to allow her to operate close inshore. She is steam-powered, and she is the first ship fitted with a revolving gun turret. And her turret gives her this enormous advantage of being able to fire her guns in any direction that she wants.
The Monitor was unlike anything ever seen in maritime history. Just 180 feet long, and with a deck only 18 inches above the waterline. The Monitor was designed to give enemy gunners as small a target as possible. At the Battle of Hampton Roads, the Monitor engaged in a 4-hour gun battle with the South's warship, the Virginia. Both sides claimed victory, but it was the Union vessel that made a global impact and gave her name to a whole new class of ship, the Monitor. 3,000 miles away, the British in particular embraced the idea. Portsmouth Dockyard is home to a First World War gunboat. A classic example of what the Monitor became, the M33. The outbreak of war in 1914 led to a rush of new warships. At the time, Winston Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty. He saw monitors as a key part of an expanded British fleet. It's said that Churchill designed M33 himself, scribbling the plans on the back of a cigarette packet. Those plans were made real by the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast. 3 years earlier, they'd made their name building the Titanic, but now they hurried to build an intimidating little warship.
She's a tiny ship, but what she's carrying is a pair of 6-inch guns. Now these are guns normally found on cruisers. So tiny hull, very big armament, almost no armour at all, and very slow speed. These are not ships that are designed to fight other warships. They only have a single use, which is to get inshore, manoeuvre slowly around, respond to requests from ashore to put down this very heavy gunfire on enemy soldiers.
Both guns could fire 8 100-pound shells per minute. The muzzle velocity was nearly 2,000 miles an hour. And within weeks of being completed, M33 had a chance to prove her capabilities. By April 1915, the war had spread to a new front. The narrow strait in the eastern Mediterranean, known as the Dardanelles. Britain and France hoped to undermine Germany by forcing their ally Turkey out of the war. Their ultimate aim was Constantinople. But first would come a massive invasion of the Gallipoli Peninsula.
So, because this is an amphibious landing, there's British and Anzac, Australian and New Zealand troops are put ashore, there is a need for ships to provide support to the soldiers ashore.
The older battleships in the bay were letting go as hard as they could. And the harder they fired, the more confident you felt. So, although it was a precarious position for a bloke to find himself in, you sort of made up your mind that, well, we're here, and the only way the enemy can get us off is by carrying us off, feet first.
But the Allies' great battleships were vulnerable to German U-boats.
Secondly, the battleship guns are not ideal for providing support for soldiers ashore. They're intended to sling shells over quite a flat trajectory. What you need to support soldiers is plunging fire, shells that go up and then drop down again.
War in the Dardanelles was tailor-made for M33. She sat just 6 feet in the water, compared to 30 feet for a battleship, so she could operate close to beaches. Her guns, meanwhile, could be elevated 16 degrees higher than those on a battleship, to achieve that plunging fire the soldiers on the beaches desperately needed.
Despite the fact you couldn't see the Turk, he was pelting us with everything he'd got from all sides. Well, sure enough, I got hit, and as I lay there, I said, thank Christ for that.
The Turks at Gallipoli were tough, their gunfire murderous. Those Allied troops that did get ashore were forced to retreat after a bloody series of battles lasting 8 months. The Gallipoli Campaign has gone down in history as a military fiasco. But the role played by M33 established the importance of artillery support for troop landings.
M33 is the spark that ignites a whole new piece of technology. In the First World War, coastal bombardment and amphibious warfare becomes steadily more and more important. At Gallipoli, they're really learning how to do it. They're learning the importance of ships like M33. After the Gallipoli campaign, they keep monitors for the next 30 years.
But small ships don't have to be armed to make history. In 1940, the most famous gathering of small vessels took place off the beaches of Dunkirk. Together, they saved thousands of lives.
When the dive bombers came down, we were so lucky that our part of the queue weren't hit.
The River Thames in late summer is the setting for a remarkable reunion. Arriving from all over Britain is a collection of Second World War veterans. When fleeing the German army, they were famously rescued by a motley collection of small ships. Together, they turned one of the greatest disasters in British history into an unexpected triumph.
It's because of you gentlemen that have made the effort to come and given us our freedom today that we are here. So it's your day.
On the 10th of May 1940, Germany invaded France. Hitler's army swiftly forced the French backwards, along with the 394,000-strong British Expeditionary Force.
The British and the French had been completely outmaneuvered by the Germans. The best thing to do was to withdraw to the coast and try and get home. So the British Army started withdrawing into this pocket at Dunkirk.
We were bombed by the dive bombers all the way. At times it got so bad we had to stop the vehicle, get out and lay in the ditches till it was all over.
The German was a damn good soldier, no doubt about it, and it was quite a war machine. It was man against boys, really.
By the last week in May, 338,000 British and French troops were trapped on the North French coast. Rescue by the Royal Navy seemed to be their only hope. But in Dunkirk, the small harbour was already damaged and dangerous after successive German air attacks. Nearby, sandbanks and sloping shallow beaches meant naval vessels couldn't get close to the shore. In London, they accepted that most of the British troops would not be coming home. One man was given the seemingly impossible task of bringing the troops back. Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay.
He understood the sandbanks, he understood the coastline, he understood the minefields. There's nothing, basically, he didn't know about that stretch of the narrow seas.
Ramsay's task, set by the Admiralty, was to rescue 45,000 men. He would have just 2 days to do it. The remaining 293,000 were to be left to fend for themselves. Ramsay ignored the order. He put into action a plan he called Operation Dynamo. At the heart of the plan would be small ships. Lots of them. In 1939, the Navy had made an inventory of all the small vessels in the country. Ramsay knew he had a civilian fleet of thousands at his disposal. An appeal went out on the BBC for small ships to assemble on the south coast.
They could be cockle boats, 12-foot cockle boats. They could be Dutch scoots, as they were called. Ships, lifeboats from merchant ships in the Pool of London. Fire tenders, pleasure boats, these things that go up and down the Thames with kiss-me-quick hats. That kind of thing. And of course, private boats.
In amongst the flotilla of little ships were 19 lifeboats from the Royal National Lifeboat Institution. Amongst them was the Thomas Kirkwright from Poole in Dorset. In order to avoid enemy fire, the channel crossing was going to be at night and without lights. The Royal Navy crewed most of the lifeboats, but the boats from Ramsgate and Margate were left in the hands of the lifeboat volunteers.
It's about 30 miles from Dover to Dunkirk, and the Navy had given Ramsgate and Margate the instructions that they needed for the safest possible crossing that they could have. So they were aware of where enemy fire was concentrated. They were also aware of the areas where there were mines. So it was risky, it was dangerous, it was quite a choppy crossing as well, and again without navigation lights, so it was quite a dangerous journey across.
More than 600 little ships sailed across the channel. They joined 39 Royal Navy destroyers waiting off the coast or in Dunkirk's small harbour. On the beach, officers organised the thousands of troops into long, orderly queues. By this time, the Germans were well aware of what was going on.
When the dive bombers came down, the queue just spread out between the beach, the shops, and the water's edge, so you're a smaller target. And when the bombing had gone, the bodies were floating in the water. We were so lucky that our part of the queue weren't hit.
I was on this queue waiting to get onto one of the little boats, and I don't know how long I was on it for, but it must have been 2 or 3 hours, and eventually I got to the front of the queue, and when I got to the front of the queue, there were 2 officers, one each side of the queue with revolvers in their hand. They said to me, "What division are you at?" And I said, "I'm the 44th Home Counties Division, sir." He said, "Well, bugger off out of here because you're in the wrong queue."
James Baines eventually made it back to Britain, along with 338,000 others. Admiral Ramsay's operation had surpassed all expectations. His little ships were the key, either by ferrying men to the waiting destroyers or by taking them home right across the channel. It's believed the 19 lifeboats accounted for 3,500 men between them, but success came at a cost. 6 destroyers were sunk, and over 100 little ships never came back.
Of the 19 lifeboats that went out to Dunkirk, many of them were severely damaged and quite a few of them came back riddled with bullet holes. There was only one lifeboat that was lost, which was the Viscountess Wakefield from Hythe Lifeboat Station, which was completely wrecked during the Dunkirk evacuation, so never returned.
These few, these precious few, let us now remember in silence.
It was the best possible outcome. To get home, British and French, 1/3 men, was the best possible outcome. So in that sense, Dunkirk was a victory, and also it was, in a sense, a war-changing victory, because the British had pulled it off. And it's a sort of strange lightheadedness took hold in Britain, where people were saying, you know, come on Adolf, have a go if you think you're hard enough.
Each veteran today went out to defend hard-won freedoms into a world that, one way or another, wanted to remove those freedoms.
Historians have sort of competed to try and revise downwards Dunkirk, but the fact is that what could have happened would have been infinitely worse. It would have been 250,000 Brits in prisoner of war camp, and that didn't happen.
Dunkirk proved what volunteers and vast numbers of small ships could do. But elsewhere in the war, highly specialised, tiny combat vessels would play their part. They demanded secrecy, expertise, and some remarkable technology.
This is not a suicide weapon. This is developed to be operated by 2 highly skilled operators. You want them to get home so they can do their job again.
The Second World War was a coming of age for the submarine. Large vessels like the German U-boats and the Allies' diesel-electric subs were impressive. But they had their limitations. Sometimes there were missions so specific and so secretive that they demanded something much smaller. The Japanese air attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 shocked the world and dragged the United States into the war. But there's a part of the Pearl Harbor story that is very rarely told. It involved a fleet of mini submarines. One of the vessels that took part was HA-19. Mini submarines like HA-19 were built with one specific aim: to attack well-defended enemy harbors. They could do what full-size subs couldn't.
All of our harbors, including Pearl Harbor, were protected from submarine attack by submarine nets.
The challenge for Japan was to find a way to avoid these highly effective defenses. In the late 1930s, they came up with an ingenious solution.
The goal was to have a submarine that would have such a shallow draft that when an American naval ship came in or out of that harbor, they could simply slide through the nets while they were down for the American battleship or cruiser or whatever to go through.
By early December 1941, the Japanese had 5 microsubs ready to deploy. They were nicknamed targets to disguise their real purpose. Each microsub would be carried into combat by a full-size parent sub. The microsub would be released close to their objective, where the 2 powerful torpedoes in the bow could be a threat to any harbor in the world.
I don't know in the history of midget submarines anybody who put that particular combination together before, to have such a powerful submarine operated by such a massive bank of batteries that could function as well as this did.
At Pearl Harbor, Japan planned to attack the US Pacific Fleet from both the air and underwater. A fleet of aircraft carriers with over 300 planes sailed from Japan on the 26th of November. 3 submarine groups also made for Hawaii. The central group contained 5 full-size subs, each with its own mini-sub. Their mission: to attack the ships at anchor inside Pearl Harbor. On the night of the 6th of December, the mother subs took up their final position. Carried on one was HA-19. crewed by 22-year-old Kazuo Sakamaki and 23-year-old Kiyoshi Inagaki. They were about to carry out the mini-sub's very first mission. Just after midnight, the mini-subs were released. But on board HA-19, something was badly wrong. The gyro compass was broken. Steering was impossible.
Without a key component in the navigation system. Sakamaki had to depend entirely on sightings from the periscope to see the direction towards the lights of Pearl Harbor as he went. It drifted in circles a bit, and finally, as it got to the entrance to the harbor, ran aground on a coral reef.
With the batteries now damaged, Sakamaki and Inagaki were in grave danger.
At 135 degrees Fahrenheit, it would have been a sauna underwater, and when the air was fouled by the leakage coming from the batteries, it became an extraordinarily noxious environment as well. Both of the two men on board passed out from the fumes.
But two of their comrades were having greater success. Their mini-sub had evaded the anti-submarine nets by following a cargo ship into Pearl Harbor. But just after 6:30 a.m., their tiny periscope was spotted.
And it was making 12 knots behind an American ship actually heading for the base at the time. The USS Ward, a destroyer, went to attack, and when they saw it, its number 3 gun did actually put a hole through the submarine and sank it.
It was the first American shot of the Second World War. Despite the sighting of the mini-sub, no one at Pearl Harbor realized that a full-scale Japanese attack was underway. When the bombers appeared in the skies just before 8 a.m., they came as a complete surprise. As the US Pacific Fleet burned, the crippled mini-sub HA-19 was swept onto rocks close to shore. Inagaki and Sakamaki were in bad shape.
Inagaki, as he came out of the submarine, according to Sakamaki's testimony, he drowned as soon as he hit the water. He was too weak to even make it to shore, having been basically in a sauna for 24 hours. Sakamaki crawled to the shore and collapsed and passed out and awoke in the morning with an American standing over him.
Sakamaki was America's first prisoner of World War II. He was distraught, writing later, "I betrayed the expectations of our people and became a sad prisoner of war, disloyal to my country."
Sakamaki did try several times to commit harikiri and actually requested that his life be terminated because of the shame.
But the Japanese achieved a major military success at Pearl Harbor. 19 ships were sunk or seriously damaged, and nearly 2,500 Americans killed. By contrast, the Japanese lost just 64 servicemen, 9 of those coming from the experimental micro-sub mission. It's believed just one of the 5 subs actually got to fire its torpedoes inside Pearl Harbor. What's certain is that all 5 ended up sunk or scuttled. Kazuo Sakamaki was the only survivor. HA-19's journey was far from over. It was used as a highly effective propaganda tool, raising money for the war against Japan.
The United States actually put this on the back of a truck and shipped it all over the country, and it visited 42 states and was seen by hundreds of thousands of people during the war. But you'd have to make a donation to war bonds to clamp on the platform and look in, and many, many thousands of people did so. The submarine ended up being a much more effective tool for the United States than it was for the Japanese.
Whilst the Japanese microsubs failed, just a few days later, on the other side of the world, an even smaller craft would prove far more successful. A rare example of a most unusual combat ship can be found in a museum storeroom in Portsmouth, England.
This is an Italian San Bartolomeo torpedo, but it's not just any torpedo. This is a human torpedo. This is designed to be driven into action by a pair of frogmen. It was very difficult to drive. Its operators nicknamed it the Mayali, or the pig, basically because it's a pig to steer.
By the start of the Second World War, the Italian Navy were world experts at underwater warfare. Like the Japanese mini-subs, the Mayale were clamped to the deck of a parent submarine and delivered to their target.
This is not a suicide weapon. This is developed to be operated by two highly skilled operators. You want them to get home so they can do their job again. So this is not a torpedo in the conventional sense of the word. It doesn't have a warhead on the end that goes off when you jam it into the side of a ship. What it has is two explosive charges. They would get as close to the target as possible, ideally underneath it. They would then drop both of those charges underneath the target. They would then turn around with the remainder of the submarine from here backwards, and they would go home.
The Mayale was powered by electric batteries. Its two-man crew wore rubber suits and breathed bottled oxygen.
So you've got two frogmen in here. One of them is actually the pilot of the craft, so he sits in the front seat. He's got depth control. He's got a little fairly primitive instrument panel, and it's his job to take it into action. His number two, the guy in the back seat, his job really is to help with the deployment of the mines, drive it into action, drop the mines, get out again. So the job is very simple in concept, but actually extremely hard to do.
But that's exactly what 6 Italian frogmen achieved in the weeks after Pearl Harbor. Italy, as an ally of Germany, was fighting the British for naval supremacy of the Mediterranean. A successful attack on the British fleet in Alexandria would be a significant victory. On the 3rd of December, the submarine Shire left the Italian port of La Spezia carrying 3 Mayale. A week later, it picked up 6 frogmen from the island of Leros. On the 18th of December, Shire arrived outside Alexandria harbour undetected. Just after midnight, the Mayale evaded anti-submarine nets by slipping in behind 3 destroyers. They didn't even have to dive beneath the surface to access the harbour. 2 headed for the battleships Valiant and Queen Elizabeth, the third for a tanker named the Sagona. All successfully placed their charges. But there, their luck runs out.
The operators try and get ashore, they are caught, the British are interrogating them while the clock is ticking on the warheads. 2 of them are actually being interrogated on board one of the ships that they've planted charges underneath.
The British deliberately detained the Italians on HMS Valiant, hoping they'd confess if their own lives were at risk. But the frogmen bravely refused to talk. Then, just after 6 a.m, the charge under Valiant detonated, closely followed by Queen Elizabeth and the tanker Sagona. All 3 ships sank to the bottom of Alexandria harbour. Miraculously, all 6 of the Italian frogmen survived the attack.
Now the British are able to recover the ships because they've sunk in a harbour, but it takes months. They are out of service for nearly a year. So very, very cheap, very simple technology has put down a battleship, and that's what this technology is all about. This allows a smaller power to punch above its weight.
For a few vital months, the Italians became the dominant force in the Eastern Mediterranean.
Human torpedoes don't change the direction of naval warfare, but they are a significant moment in history. And there is that little window in the Mediterranean in 1941 when these things have had an absolutely dramatic effect on major world events.
The missions of the mini-subs and human torpedoes pushed the boundaries of technology. But a year later, a team of Royal Marines would set out on the most arduous mission of all, using only canoes.
It was exceptionally dangerous. The chances of getting home alive were practically zero.
1942. The Second World War is in its 3rd year, and the Allies have a major problem. Fast German cargo ships continue to break through Allied blockades, to reach the ports of Germany and occupied Europe. Each and every ship is adding to the German war effort.
There are a couple of ways that German ships could get in. One was to go right up to northern Norway and then creep down through territorial waters. And the other way was simply to dart eastwards across the Bay of Biscay from the mid-Atlantic into French ports.
A way had to be found to stop the cargo ships. Bordeaux, the major French port in the west, was the obvious target. But bombing the port wasn't an option. The civilian casualties would be too high. Another method had to be found. This specialist task was given to Lord Louis Mountbatten and the team at Combined Operations Headquarters. Mountbatten knew just the man to lead a stealth attack to wreck an enemy harbour. 28-year-old Major Herbert Blondie Hasler. Hasler's mission was codenamed Operation Frankton and would make use of his particular expertise, canoes. In early July, Hasler selected 30 Marines and brought them for training at Lumps Fort in Southsea. The huts they used stood in what is now a rose garden. None of the men had any experience with canoes. Hasler described them as weedy, whom life has kicked around enough to develop the courage and will to see a job through. The Marines' training was grueling.
The first thing that Hasler needed to do was ensure that they had the required fitness level. This he did by basically making them run down the beach. He used to make them jump in bare feet onto the shingle, stones, 8 foot below, and then they would run up and down. And once he'd attained the fitness level that he required of them, he then put them in canoes and he showed them how to paddle, absolutely everything to do with the use of canoes.
At first, they practiced on the Thames, learning how to paddle without making a sound. Then they rehearsed slipping into Portsmouth Harbour undetected.
These were basic Royal Marines who had no specialised skills, i.e. navigation or seamanship skills at all. At all times, he made sure they had one really important piece of equipment, and that was a Reliant life jacket, because most of them couldn't swim.
The canoes themselves were very simple, flat-bottomed, canvas sides, easily collapsible. Officially, they were Cockle Mark IIs, but they were nicknamed cockle shells. With winter approaching, plans were finalised. The Marines would be taken close to the Gironde estuary by submarine. They would then paddle themselves 60 miles upstream before planting limpet mines on the cargo ships docked in Bordeaux.
It was exceptionally dangerous. The chances of success weren't that high. The chances of getting home alive were practically zero.
Bearing in mind that they only started the training at the end of July, and they were going out on a submarine at the end of November, it didn't give them an awful lot of time. In fact, in truth, they were not trained enough.
Despite Lord Mountbatten's reservations, Major Hasler insisted that he should take part in the mission. On the 1st of December 1942, the Marines selected for the operation boarded the submarine HMS Tuna and set off from Holyloch in Scotland. They travelled south across the Bay of Biscay and on the 7th of December successfully surfaced 12 miles south of the Gironde.
The method of delivering the canoes on the water was by a cradle which was attached to the gun turret. So the men and the canoe were swung out and placed on the sea. They had a machine gun, knife, grenades, and a whole host of, well, all their food and their water for the trip itself.
Their real weapon was magnetic mines. That is, magnetic mines that they would place onto the hull of a ship just below the waterline.
But approaching the coast, the Marines were 60 miles and at least 4 days paddling from the port where they hoped to use those mines.
The 5 canoes proceeded as one unit towards the coast, and it was very, very cold, icy conditions, and they hit a tidal race. They hadn't been trained for a tidal race, only rough water, and unfortunately during the first tidal race a canoe was capsized, and that put paid to not only the canoe but the 2 individuals inside. Whilst they were wearing life jackets, unfortunately hypothermia caught them.
The remaining canoes continued on their mission.
They had to avoid people at all costs. Particularly they had to avoid the Germans. That was probably the biggest problem. They had to lie up in the cold, in the damp, with their rations, without warmth, try and keep themselves together. Very little sleep, lots of paddling, sometimes against the tide. The odds were always against them.
After 5 days of paddling and 6 months of planning, the port of Bordeaux was in sight. But by now, 2 more canoes had been lost, either captured or sunk. The surviving Marines were Albert Lever and William Mills in one canoe, William Sparks and the operation leader Blondie Hasler in the other. They were finally at their target. Hasler and Sparks took the west side of the harbour, Lever and Mills the east. Both boats successfully attached their limpet mines and paddled silently away. Five ships were damaged by the explosions. But Operation Frankton was a limited success. Bordeaux harbour was disrupted for a while, but the 5 damaged ships were soon repaired and back in action. Hasler and his crewmate Sparks were the only survivors of Operation Frankton. They made it home, having been on the run for 5 months.
I think it's all about bravery. Hasler was brave, but I think the men more so. They didn't have his experience, and they followed him. And unfortunately, they were cut down in their prime of life.
The Marines are now known as the Cockle Shell Heroes. Lord Mountbatten declared the mission to be the most courageous and imaginative of all the raids carried out by the men of combined operations.
We should certainly remember them as extraordinarily brave, dedicated, testing new techniques, and making history in that sense, setting a standard.
The smallest ships of war have changed and developed with each passing age. But whether backed by expertise, immense bravery, or sheer willpower, they have proved an ability to defy the elements and superior odds. In failure and success, the stories of the smallest ships will long be remembered.